Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer and it's time to answer some more of your questions about how classic games achieved their visual tricks. This video is not only going to be covering the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo as usual, but for the first time it'll also include the 32X, TurboGrafx 16 and Game Boy as well. As you follow along, why not try to guess how these were done before the answer is revealed? Let's not waste any time and get right into it. So we'll start this video with the TurboGrafx 16, or the PC engine as it was called in Japan, with this question from Fel Temp Reparatio. Do I know how Magical Chase did the background tricks on stage 3? This hardware supports only one background layer, but there's clearly a lot of independent vertical movement that they've never otherwise seen before on the console. Let's fly in to take a closer look. Magical Chase was developed by Quest, a team who went on to make the Tactics Ogre series, and is probably one of the better known TG16 exclusives. Not just because it's so technically impressive, but also because of how ridiculously expensive it is to buy a legit copy these days due to its limited production run. To be honest, the entire game is filled with incredible effects that seem impossible on the hardware, but the question is specifically asking about what we see here on stage 3. Not only does it look like there's two background layers that are horizontally scrolling independently to create a parallax effect, but the foreground is also moving up and down. As the question correctly stated, the TG16 only had one background layer. So what kind of programming witchcraft is going on here? What's your guess? So first, the sprite layer. This obviously covers the player character, projectiles, enemies and collectibles, but also on the sprite layer are the parts of the upper and lower wooden beams that stick out at the top and bottom. These are animated to move up and down in sync with the beams, so the sky background can be seen behind them. That's not too complex though and seems fairly straightforward. Where the real magic is happening is on the background layer. As I explained in my video about the TurboGrafx 16, the console had the ability to change what part of the background tilemap was currently displayed on screen on a per scanline basis. This is how it was able to draw a static section of the screen for something like a HUD, and we can see that exact implementation in Magical Chase. The full tilemap looks like this, and on scanline 217, it's told to draw the part of the tilemap that contains the HUD by specifying the memory address where this is located on the tilemap. So with this knowledge, we can then look at the rest of the screen and see how it's swapping between the different parts of the tile map to display the plain blue sky at the top, the upper beam, the clouds in the middle, the lower beam, and the clouds at the bottom. But there's more to it than that, because those beams are moving up and down, in opposite directions to each other too. This is done by altering the scanline where the tile map position changes every single frame, for each segment except for the last one that contains the HUD. Not only that, but each segment is scrolling at different speeds too. Despite all of this, it flies along at a solid 60 frames a second without missing a beat, even with the screen full of sprites. It's pretty incredible. Onto the Mega Drive, and in a previous video, I explained how the Dragon Ball Z Super Buyuu games on the Super Nintendo did their split screen visuals. Naturally, there were a few viewers, including Zekium, Biggie87, and Sentitab Naviscues 8673, that asked, well, how did Bandai make the Mega Drive do the same trick in its equivalent game, Buyuu Retsuden, without access to the same tools? Let's stare menacingly at each other while we figure this out. So this is Dragon Ball Z Buyuu Retsuden on the Mega Drive. As you can see, it's extremely similar in terms of gameplay and presentation to the Super Buyuu games, including using the split screen mechanic when the characters separate far enough apart or they jump high into the air. You can see here though that it doesn't look quite the same, opting to keep the divider as a straight vertical line most of the time. It only shows it at an angle very briefly when the characters swap places, and it's clearly a much more jagged and coarse look compared to the Super Nintendo games. There's two elements to this. The first is that it's basically doing the same thing the Super Buyuu games did, and that's having two identical planes. The planes scroll together when the characters are close together, but once they are far enough apart, they scroll independently. In this case, the background plane is almost always full screen, while the foreground plane only covers half the screen. In this case, it's always on the left half. When a divider line appears, this is simply a sprite that's overlaid over the top. The second element is that diagonal angle when the character swaps sides, the one that looks like a staircase. It looks like that because they are effectively cutting out the shape in the tile maps using transparent tiles. You'll also notice there's no divider line during this transition either, probably because it would make it look worse. While Buyuu Retsuden doesn't look as good as the games on its rival platform, I think they still managed to capture the essence of those games with the tools they had. Speaking of the Mega Drive attempting to replicate an effect seen on the Super Nintendo, AlanSign4850 commented that Crusader of Centy, also known as Celil, has a chameleon boss that does its own version of the disappearing act that we saw a couple of Super Nintendo games doing in a previous video. It obviously looks different, as the Mega Drive didn't have the color maths hardware to do what the SNES did, but it does make you wonder how they actually did it. So, let's find out. Crusader of Centy is very clearly heavily inspired by the Zelda series, and is another game that's actually pretty rare and can demand a pretty high price for an original cartridge. Here's the chameleon boss you encounter in the game, who I believe is just creatively called Chameleon. Before I get onto the explanation, I want to give a shout out to Rowan from the Crusader of Centy speedrunning community, who provided me a save file for just before this boss, so I didn't need to play over half the game to reach it myself. Now clearly this looks different to the Super Nintendo games we've previously looked at, but it's still a pretty neat effect they've managed to make here. What's your guess on how this was done? Pause the video, make a comment, then see if you were right. I'll give you a hint though, even though it might look like it, it's not using shadow and highlight mode. Firstly, when the chameleon is visible, he's actually a sprite, and has the same visibility as the other characters. However, he's using a different palette. They are all using palette 0, but he's using palette 3. You'll notice though that palette 3 is a duplicate of palette 2. This is because his little minions that he summons throughout the fight use palette 2. I guess they put them on a separate palette because they didn't want them going camo too and wanted to keep them visible. When he turns invisible, every single one of the colours in his palette gradually turn white, similar to what we've seen previously, but they don't stay that way. They gradually become coloured again, but now it's duplicating palette 1, the palette used for the background. At this point, his sprite vanishes from the screen. Instead, it's replaced by the foreground plane, which contains an outline of his image with a copy of the background inside it. The wave effect when he moves while invisible is created by warping this foreground plane using line scrolling, something we've seen quite a few times in this series of videos. Once he stops moving, the vanishing process is reversed to make him visible again. Developers Nextech really thought outside the box for this one and managed to get a pretty convincing result. If you're enjoying this content and would like to see more of it, make sure you subscribe so you know when I upload new videos. In my previous video, I covered some effects from Gunstar Heroes, probably Treasure's best known game. But I've had some questions concerning some of their other projects, so let's take a look at another one now with McDonald's Treasureland Adventure. Colton Riffle 2310 and DA Boardman both want to know how they managed to do some 3D polygon effects that are seen during the game's startup and intro sequence. Specifically, the 3D rotating cube, the spinning treasure logo, the waving treasure map on the title screen, and the interactive polygon viewer that can be accessed with a cheat code. Lots to examine here, so let's get into it. Alright, so the first thing we basically see when booting the game up is the spinning letters in the treasure logo. These are on the background plane, and this is kind of a combination of two techniques I've covered in previous videos. The first is that spinning animation. This is basically the same solution we saw James Pond 3 doing. It's an animation that's created using lots of different tiles in different orientations. These tiles update before each pair of letters appears on screen. That's how the spinning was done, but what about the zoom? Well, remember back when I explained how the giant face was scaling in the Lawnmower Man? That's exactly what's happening here. The tile map that contains the spinning letters is stretched out horizontally and animated to reduce in width as they get smaller. This combines with raster effects that are used to initially stretch out the letters vertically before returning them to their regular height at the same time the horizontal animation happens, making the scaling look very smooth. Next, we see the rotating cube. This effect is done entirely on the foreground plane, plane A, so it's not using any sprites. From what I've been able to determine, this is genuinely a real polygonal cube they have created, which we know the Mega Drive is capable of doing on its own, especially when there's nothing else happening on screen like here. And the reason why I've come to that conclusion, rather than thinking it's just some fancy pre-baked animation or sprite trickery, is that the game has a hidden 3D engine test, which one of the comments mentioned. If you go to the password screen, enter the password balloons, Ruby, M, and Ronald, and then press start 3 times and quickly hold up and left, the Macca's sign changes to a 3D model which you can zoom and rotate, and this is also done entirely on plane A. You can even change the object, and some of them are clearly pieces that are used to construct the cube seen during the startup sequence. There also appears to be a 3DS for Sega, and a full Sega logo, but these aren't used in the final game. Finally, there's what looks like some kind of aeroplane or spaceship. If you use the Japanese version and input some Game Genie codes, you could swap this plane for another one that might look familiar to many of you. Yeah, this is an R-Wing from Star Fox. Apparently, this was included as a test for what would eventually become the startup animation, and they decided to leave it in the game as an Easter egg. It wasn't even hinted at by anyone at Treasure themselves though until 2021, when President and then programmer Masato Maegawa revealed it in an interview with Retro Gamer magazine. Finally, the waving treasure map on the title screen. This is done with a combination of horizontal and vertical line scrolling to create the wave pattern, which is something I've covered other games doing in the past. Kolos3284 and Yahoo9957 both ask, may I please explore Surging Aura? It uses 3D graphics in some areas, screen interpolation, line by line occurrence, and even sprite scaling in every battle. The wording is the same in both of these, so I don't know if this is the same user or not, but regardless, I know you've been asking about this for a while, but your patience is being rewarded now. Let's examine some of this stuff from one of the Mega Drive's Japanese exclusive RPGs. The first thing we'll look at is this cutscene near the beginning of the game. The player character has basically just been killed and is now in some kind of purgatory, where this weird 6-armed rabbit creature resurrects him with a cool looking spell. There's a funky animation going on in the background there that looks a bit like what you see in the background of battles in Earthbound, and what looks to be a wireframe box that's surrounding the player. The background effect is the easy part. This is simply an animation created by cycling the colours in the palette. Then it's manipulated with a combination of vertical line scrolling and horizontal tile movement, in the same way we just saw the McDonald's game doing that for the treasure map. But that wireframe box, that's something else. We've already established that Sega's console could do full, flat shaded polygons, and we also know it could do wireframe. So the question is this actually a real, genuine wireframe mesh, or are they just faking it? Well, this is on the foreground plane, it's not a sprite, so we can rule that out. As near as I can tell, this is indeed a real wireframe. The tiles making up this object are lines of varying lengths, and they are combining together in such a way as to create this rotating shape. It's essentially a much simpler implementation of the wireframe cutscenes in Ranger X, as those were constructed the same way. I don't see any reason why they would bother faking it when they could just do it for real. Feel free to leave your thoughts and reasoning in the comments though if you disagree and believe it's not a true 3D wireframe. The other feature we'll study is the sprite scaling that happens during battles. As a battle progresses, the enemies move forward and backward and scale accordingly. These are sprites this time, so there's no background raster effects going on. How's the game doing this? Any guesses? Your first thought might be that it's using the trick of overlapping tiles that we've seen some games do in the past, and the Mega Drive certainly could do that. But no, that's not what's happening here. The tiles are staying together without any overlap. But the image is still changing size. The different sizes of the sprites are not stored in memory, so this is another example of real-time sprite scaling done in software. This is likely done with a very similar approach to how Star Ocean did it that we looked at in my previous video, using a linear or nearest neighbour algorithm. The Mega Drive did have more grunt than the SNES obviously, but you'll still notice that there's basically nothing else going on when this scaling is happening, allowing it to perform the calculation as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, Surging Aura hasn't received a completed English fan translation to date, though I do know there's at least 2 different projects in the works in varying states of completeness, so we'll see what happens in that space in the near future. Staying with Sega for this next one, but moving away from the base Mega Drive to talk about the 32X add-on, LF222 says they've always wanted to know how they pulled off the reflection effect in the Techno Tower boss of Knuckles' Chaotix. Sure thing, let's see what's going on with this. Knuckles' Chaotix is the closest thing the 32X had to a Sonic game, as it's more of a spin-off with unique mechanics, but still interesting in its own right. It primarily uses the 32X to draw the character sprites, giving them more detail and allowing them to scale larger or smaller. The rest of the Mega Drive's planes, including the sprite plane, are used to make the backgrounds more colourful and detailed than they otherwise could be. This is the boss fight the question is asking about when you reach the top of the Techno Tower. It's this big robot that's piloted by Robotnik. The main body of it is made to look like a glass dome, seemingly reflecting an area behind the camera where the player can't see, though it's just a mirror image of the actual background that you can see. The question is asking about how that reflection is done. Now, the boss here, like the player characters, is being drawn by the 32X. It's technically neither a background tile map, nor a tile-based sprite. In my video that covered the Mega Drive add-ons, I explained that the 32X didn't work with tiles, but instead plotted each pixel on screen individually using a dual frame buffer, which didn't work particularly well for scrolling backgrounds, which is why the Mega Drive needed to handle those, but did work well for drawing big detailed objects like this. This reflection effect on its body is simply a pre-made animation that moves left or right based on the movement of the boss, made possible by the 32X's hardware. The base Mega Drive wouldn't be able to do something like this without making the boss a background and using some animated tiles, but that would mean the actual background would be less detailed. Let's move on to another platform that I haven't covered yet in these videos, and that's the Game Boy, with this question from RayVGM. They'd love for me to explain how developer Titus did the multi-parallax scrolling title screen intro in Prehisorik Man with only one background layer. I know Chiropoulos likes using this game as an example of a limit pusher on the GB, but I don't think he specifically covered this, so let's explore this one. So here's the title screen for the Game Boy version of Prehisorik Man, and yeah, wow, look at that! That's pretty insane, and if you didn't know any better, you'd swear there was multiple background layers there. But I can assure you there is only one.
There can be only one.
So, what the heck is going on here? Here's the background tile map. It looks like this. What's happening here is that the game is splitting it up into a number of segments to scroll them individually at different speeds, in the same concept that we saw at the beginning of the video with Magical Chase on the TG16. Scanline 0 to 31, where the majority of the logo is, don't actually scroll at all and remain static. The 3 lines of clouds are then individually split into their own segments to scroll at different speeds. Scanline 32 to 43, then 44 to 51, then 52 to 55. Scanlines 56 to 87 consist of those distant trees in the background, as they scroll at a different speed as well. Scanline 88 to 127 is the closest set of plants, and this one is a particularly clever optical illusion because it also includes those horizontal lines in the background that are supposed to look like the ground. These are technically scrolling at the same rate as the plants, but because they are just straight lines, it looks like they aren't actually moving. Finally, the fast moving ground at the very front is on scanline 128 to 143. Well, technically it's to scanline 153, but we can't see those last 10. That's only half of what's going on. As you have probably guessed, the rest of what we see here is primarily made up of sprites. Let's switch it over to the Game Boy Color so this becomes more visibly distinct. As we can see, clouds that pass over the prehistoric part of the logo are sprites, and the bottom portion of the word man in the logo is also a sprite, which allows the background clouds to pass behind it. The foreground palm trees are sprites, and animated to move left to right across the screen at the same rate as the ground is scrolling. Prehisorik Man himself is also obviously a sprite. But you know what's not a sprite? That sign he drags in every now and then with the credits on it. Where is that coming from? That is the Game Boy's window layer. Normally this would just be a static part of the screen, like a HUD, but unlike the Mega Drive's similar window plane, it can actually be scrolled in any direction. A good example of this is Link's Awakening. The window layer is normally docked to the bottom of the screen, but what you see is only a portion of it. When you press start, it scrolls up to cover the whole screen, allowing you to see it all. Prehisorik Man is using the same concept here, except it's scrolling in and out from the side of the screen. Pretty cool, right? Be honest, did you realise the Game Boy's window layer could even do that? Sticking with the Game Boy, CShep99 says they've always been curious about how Pokemon Red and Blue scale up the back sprites. Everyone says they made the sprites half size to save on space, and it is clear that the game is doubling up the pixels to make the sprites twice as big, but they've never been able to find information on how they were able to do it. This is an interesting question that's got a fairly complex answer, but I'll do my best to keep this as accessible as possible. So yeah, it's actually pretty obvious when you're looking at the battle screens in the Gen 1 games that the back sprites are less detailed and lower resolution to the front sprites. This is indeed because the back sprites themselves are stored in the ROM in a smaller size, and the game is essentially doubling the size before displaying them on screen. Presumably this was done to save on cartridge space. These games were already pushing the Game Boy to its limits in a lot of ways though, and this scaling was only a part of that. You see, Game Freak actually wrote a software compression and decompression system for all of the battle sprites in the game. The sprite tiles are all stored in the game's ROM in their compressed format, and the game decompresses what it needs in real time using a double buffering algorithm, which is probably part of the reason why the Pokemon take a moment to appear on the screen. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details of exactly how this works, as Retro Game Mechanics Explained has already done that, so I'll leave a link to his video in the description, but be warned that the system is quite complex and the video gets very technical. For our purposes, we don't need to know precisely how this functions, just that it happens, and this applies to both the front and the back sprites. While nothing else is needed for the front sprites after decompression, the scaling is one final step in the process for the back sprites. The front sprites can be a variety of sizes, either 5x5 tiles, 6x6 tiles, or 7x7 tiles, but the back sprites are always 7x7 tiles, even the smallest ones. There's just a lot of empty space around them. The uncompressed back sprites are stored as 4x4 tiles in size, and there is code in the game that doubles the size by converting each pixel to a 2x2 pixel. The rightmost column and the bottommost row of tiles are then discarded, which results in the final image being 7x7 tiles in size rather than 8x8. It's a pretty rudimentary way to resize an image, which resulted in the back sprites being of noticeably lower quality compared to the front sprites, but it got the job done. If you're interested, the code for these original Pokemon games has been fully disassembled and is available on GitHub, and I'll leave a link to the sprite scaling function in the description for you to check out. It's really not very complicated at all and less than 100 lines of code. Before we move on, here's another interesting little bit of trivia about this. We call these images sprites, but they are actually stored as background tiles, so technically they are in fact backgrounds. Also, these battle screens are being drawn entirely to the Game Boy's window layer, making it another use of the window layer that you may not have thought about before. Let's finish the video off with the Super Nintendo and this question from Stradalia. He's intrigued by the Triforce rendering from the intro to The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and wants to know exactly how they did it. Specifically, he's asking if this is actually a fake effect using window masks like we've seen previously. So let's have the courage to gain the wisdom of how the Super Nintendo's power was used to accomplish this. See what I did there? Everyone watching will no doubt be familiar with this intro animation, as the pieces of the Triforce appear 3D and rotate before coming together. Well, to immediately answer the question, no, there's no window mask trickery going on here. In fact, there's no windows being used in this scene at all. As it's been somewhat of a recurring theme in this video, these are in fact genuine 3D polygons. Like the Mega Drive, the Super Nintendo could still do this even without the Super FX chip, though you'll notice here that the background is completely black with nothing else happening, so all of the resources can be entirely dedicated to this task. So, how's it doing it? The tiles that make up a piece of the Triforce are stored in a section of VRAM used for sprites, so these are technically sprite tiles. One piece of the Triforce uses a 6x8 grid of tiles. Because they are tiles, they only need to be loaded into memory once, allowing them to be drawn on screen as many times as a developer wants as the hardware will allow. In this case, it's being drawn to the screen 3 times. As you can see, the polygons are rendered into the tiles and they are animated to show their dimensions. This is a different approach to how we saw the Mega Drive doing it earlier, as that was using background tiles. You'll notice that the left piece is rotating identically to the top piece. The only difference is the direction they are moving, so nothing needs to be done to change this one, it can just be rendered to screen as is. The one on the right is rotating opposite to the other two though, and is mirrored by simply flipping the sprite tiles, a basic function that all of these consoles had, which explains why Nintendo opted to use sprite tiles for this rather than background tiles. So there you go, that's how this was done. Seems pretty simple, but rendering 3D polygons like this needs a lot of computing power, and wasn't really something the Super Nintendo was built to do. I think this video really showcases how developers back then pushed these consoles hard to do stuff that they were seemingly not originally designed to do. It goes to show you that limitations breed creativity, from multiple parallax effects, to split screens, to graphics compression and upscaling, to 3D polygons. I hope these videos continue to help you appreciate the work that went into games back then. I find it really fun and quite fascinating to pry these games open to see what makes them tick, and hopefully you guys do too. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.